All right, can you see a very dark screen that's yep, all right. And it says Bupe MME. We'll keep it simple, right? Um, all right, so the big picture questions here are to MME or not to MME when it comes to buprenorphine. And there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of guidance from organizations where it's the new Bruno, where we just don't talk about that. And I say that I know that's a cartoon and all that, but there's some seriousness within that of, there's the stigma, obviously, associated with buprenorphine and quite frankly, all of MOUD. Know your audience, golden rule. I know you guys. It's obvious. There's also that's the part where it gets nerdy, where there's the pharmacology behind everything, and it's the medicine's partial agonism. Makes it sound like a wimp. Turns out it's not. It's quite the polar opposite, actually. So there's those two main factors of that partial agonism and the stigma that go into pretty much all organizations saying, hey, we're not going to do this MME, morphine milligram equivalent, feeble attempt at comparing potency of opioids. It'd be like comparing citrus fruit content of, one of y'all might eat a lemon, but the other one might not eat a grapefruit and vice versa. But, we're all different in the end too. So there's things that don't get factored in overall. So all right, so for buprenorphine, big picture, there is a much longer story that I'm going to say I'm not allowed to tell today because we just have to respect everything else going on in this session. But back in the day, it's hard to believe it's been almost a decade, literally as I say that. But almost a decade ago, the CDC came out with the opioid guideline, the first rendition. When it was published, I believe it was March of that year, the buprenorphine MME factor was said to be at that time 10. Myself, others, maybe some of you had some wonderings with that. And the reason I have the phone on there is because I was actually at a pain management conference out in Las Vegas. Where else would we be, right? Out in the hallways, and I was utilizing this Zoom thing won't let me see my pictures. There we go. Oh, I don't have the picture of the hallway, but it's the Cosmopolitan. That's where the Pain Week conference was. So I was fielding a consultation, and the 10 factor just wasn't working for figuring things out for a patient case. So I did a quick search on an iPhone SE first edition. You might as well say like the first computer from Apple back in 1980, whatever, compared to today. Found multiple articles, primarily from Australia, from the Netherlands, all across the globe, that was basically saying, hey, it's definitely not 10, but we don't know, but maybe it's 30. One said 80. That's a little bit too extreme. Sent that information to some contacts at the CDC, crickets, others heard crickets. And then magically, about 3 months later at that point, so about 6 to 9 months after those guidelines, there was an announcement of, oh, turns out it's actually 30. Okay, only off by 300%. That was good. And then that's what it was. Within the next year, then folks realized that, well, if it's 30 and you have a buprenorphine with or without naloxone of 16 milligrams, relatively common dosage, that's 480 MMEs, slightly above the 50 threshold from the pain guidelines, which are not the MOUD guidelines by any means, but it was just conflicting there. So then at that point, it was hey, there's partial agonism, there's a lot of stigma. Let's just not talk about that. Fast forward to any time after that, including today, and you have folks that folks have pain and they have addiction that can overlap. And we see the off-label utilization of buprenorphine products in the milligram form. That's what makes it off-label for pain, either the chicken or the egg, both sides of which started what, utilizing buprenorphine, and we have to have our ducks in a row, and that requires numbers. So the last published MME factor for buprenorphine was 30, and now it's not published anymore. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're looking at particularly pain management buprenorphine products, even the little microgram products. They have very intricate and specified dosage initiations, starting things up, where you have to look at the MMEs of the other opioids to compare. So that's the bigger picture there. So here is the more recent 2022 CDC guideline MME factor chart. I highlighted things that changed overall. Almost irrelevant for you here today. I have those green highlights. It's the ones that changed since 2016. Doesn't matter for this conversation, but never lose a moment of education here, so just wanted to provide that for you. But if you notice, buprenorphine's not on the list. So it's still not published in one of the quote unquote go-to MME factor ideas there. But again, the last published was 30. We've got to keep the bigger picture in mind, particularly on that pharmacology side, where there is a ceiling effect, uh, typically said to be due to that partial agonism, the way that the molecule interacts with the receptor. Think key in the keyhole. It still gets the job done. It just interacts differently on the molecular chemical level, not on what the patient experiences overall necessarily. But with that, there is a ceiling effect. It's not that someone cannot overdose with buprenorphine. It's that there's the ceiling effect over time. It plateaus. It's not that it's not existent. There's other things to keep in mind overall. Really emphasizing that whole like buprenorphine is still a relatively generally accepted potent opioid that's out there. Um, so one of the things highlighted here is at the bottom here is, well, what about like children? Like, what if one of my boys, gets their hands and licks one of these strips? Turns out we're going to the ER because it is rather potent, no matter the dose overall. And that's actually, I like to highlight all the positives. This one kind of goes on the negative side here, though, where all these words are basically saying for about a decade, over a decade, buprenorphine was a not highly prescribed volume-wise medication, yet it accounted for an appreciable amount of ER visits for kids because of what I just talked about overall. So it's really doubling down on the whole. This is potent. This is something to respect and acknowledge along the way, pharmacologically speaking there too. So now on the really trying to respect the time for you guys and leave some time for Q&A here if you have any questions. Again, bigger takeaway is, the last published MME for buprenorphine was a factor of 30. That number is pointless until you multiply it by the milligrams or convert the micrograms to milligrams to figure out the overall scenario there. So if you have an 8 buprenorphine product times 30, it's 240, so on and so forth along the way. If you wanted to dive deeper into the pain realm when it comes to buprenorphine utilization, here's 2 articles, conveniently having one of the authors for each of them being this guy. So there's that out there. There's a few others, but they're not as comprehensive along the way. And I'm not saying that in some biased way or whatever, but it's just looking at the whole picture, really. All right. So I'm going to kick off the sharing screen here now. What kind of questions we got, if any? I'm going to look through the chat because a lot of people were chiming in to say hello in that time there. Any questions on utilization there? When would be appropriate, when wouldn't? It's really when you're thinking in the pain realm that it comes into play. But there is a, overlap there, particularly with the off-label utilization. So in the MOUD realm, it's not necessarily as needed or along the way. Any questions or anything? You guys going easy on me. I'll presume, never assume that all y'all are having yourselves a Monday, so it's cool. I see Bruce saying here higher doses 24 to 32 for I'll just say for MOUD overall. There is that growing trend overall. I'll throw a little the pharmacology studies there in that regard since that came up. So I really personally, it's actually professionally, but me as a professional struggled with the concept on the pharmacological side of these increasing doses of buprenorphine for MOUD. And then I stumbled upon a little light that I will share with you. There was studies done initially. You're looking at PET scans. We love them. They're great for slides, the blue and the green for the brain. And it was showing receptor saturation, saying, hey, all the seats in the stadium are full when it comes to buprenorphine. One of the tricky things, though, is that it was presumed that those were done on brains that were opioid naive. They haven't had opioid, legal, illegal, you name it, opioid, non-existent. And when thinking back now, it would have been beneficial to say, what about an opioid experienced brain scan? because receptor numbers change as substances, medications are utilized over time. We see that with other mental health medications like SSRIs, SNRIs, you name it, for depression, anxiety overall too. So that seems to be where we're at for the possible change in receptor numbers in our bodies. It would be thousands. They're microscopic. So that comes into play, I think, to Bruce's comment there. So, all right. Did it in under 10 minutes there. I think the goal was 5. My apologies.